So we kind of left off talking about film noir, the movement in Hollywood during the 1940s, but now we'll talk about kind of some of the foreign movies that were coming out. So we'll talk about Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, and he oftentimes took European stories and then created his own version of these narratives in the films that he made. He would give them kind of more of a Japanese film. He took actually Shakespeare's Macbeth, and then he placed it in an ancient Japanese setting with his story or his film Throne of Blood. And Kurosawa was kind of famous for composing every shot as if it were a painting. And he frequently used long lenses. And he also placed more than one camera at a distance from an actor to get a more powerful and natural performance from the actor. And he used a lot of wide angle lenses to provide a lot more scope for the composition. And with these techniques he gave a greater sense of, setting and scene. And he was a trained painter before he became a director, so it kind of makes sense that he composed his films in this way. He often drew and painted his own storyboards before he actually shot his movies, because he could do that. He was a painter. So, like I said, he kind of took European plays such as Macbeth's and then just put them kind of in an ancient Japanese setting. And a lot of Western directors have adapted or remade Kurosawa's movies. So like Star Wars, for instance, by George Lucas, he owes a great deal to Kurosawa's 1958 action-adventure feature, The Hidden Fortress, because, Star Wars was really deeply influenced by that movie. So here is, getting back to his movie Throne of Blood from 1957. This is a film still, and you can see how it's set up in such an interesting way here. He's really thinking about the composition and almost in a painterly way. So you can see that he's put the main character on the rule of thirds. So there's a line running here, there's a line running here, and they intersect right here. So he's actually using that. There's some diagonal lines that are leading into, and some more here, that are leading our eye into this group of people here. And so the composition is very much like a painting because he was a trained painter. So we'll kind of talk about some more foreign directors. Federico Fellini, La Dolce Vita, or The Sweet Life. And it tells the story of Marcello, a tabloid journalist who makes his career reporting on sensation, scandals, and celebrities. And then this was made in 1961. And he kind of dives into the lifestyle of the rich and famous. And he really is in there partying with these decadent people till 4 a.m. He actually joins a media circus at one point. A lot of such sensationalized news is one of the themes in the movie. And one of his fellow photographers, his name is actually nicknamed Paparazzo after the pop of the camera flash. And that's actually where the term paparazzi came from, was from this film, and that character Paparazzo in La Dolce Vita, which is, The Sweet Life in English. So here is just a still from that. And it's basically kind of a cautionary tale about a man with no center. He's kind of Marcello, the main character. He's lost in a world of excess. He dreams of doing something good, which would be writing his book, because he's actually a writer as well. But he ends up being sucked into this empty life of late night and early dawns, partying with the rich and famous. And the character seems condemned to an endless search for happiness that can just never be found. So the moral of the story is that there may be no such thing as the sweet life, which is the name of the movie in English. But it's necessary to find that out for yourself. So this is actually kind of a tragic story, actually. Definitely a famous film. So we'll talk about experimental cinema now. So in the late 1930s, Walt Disney recruited Oskar Fischinger, who was the artist from Germany that made Circles. We talked about him earlier on in this lecture. And he actually collaborated on Disney's movie Fantasia. And it really wasn't very successful because Disney opposed Fischinger's devotion to abstract art. But in 1945, Alfred Hitchcock worked with surrealist Salvador Dali, who we actually talked about earlier. He's a pretty famous surrealist. And they created a dream sequence for the movie Spellbound, in which the lead character, Gregory Peck, has a dream that unlocks his amnesia. And in the 1960s, the separation between artists and directors was really wide. They pretty much worked, Hollywood directors and video artists pretty much worked in completely different circles. And artists who made movies considered their work underground, and it mostly showed their work in galleries and small cinemas. And it was considered experimental work, really. And an early leader in the underground cinema movement was Stan Brakhage. And he actually began to paint directly on raw film, and he actually would scratch into it. And he made a lot of abstract movies. And he actually filmed The Birth of a Child in 1959, and it was really a super forbidden subject by the production code. So he was definitely doing something that was very not good by filming a birth, but pretty interesting at the same time. So we'll talk about him a little bit more. Stan Brakhage, Dog Star Man from 1964. This is a film still, and this is actually a kind of painted and then scratched into portion of the film. And he used a lot of distorted lenses, experimental film editing, and it kind of combines the shots of a man walking his dog in a snowy forest with shots of the night sky, the sun's surface, other material. The movie doesn't really have a clear plot, but it seems to be about the creation of the universe. So this is a really experimental film by Stan Brakhage. We're not going to watch that, but if you want to check him out, it's interesting to take a look at that. So we'll talk about Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising. And this is also an experimental movie that ended up influencing a lot of mainstream movie makers that came later. So it was shot in 1964 and is really just basically a documentary about the lives of a Brooklyn motorcycle gang. And this is a real gang in the 1960s. And they fix their bikes, they go to parties, they take drugs, they drink, and a lot of them end up suffering deadly crashes and then actually die. So Anger filmed it with highly saturated color, and he incorporated a soundtrack of really popular songs of that time. So it really strongly influenced the later idea of the biker movie, which was kind of a thing in the 70s or in the late 60s. So if anybody has heard of Easy Rider, it had Peter Fonda in it, I believe. And that's kind of your quintessential biker movie, but it was heavily influenced by earlier Scorpio Rising. Here's a film still from that. Kenneth Anger, Scorpio Rising. So you can see that, the color of the film is very saturated. He must be using a filter of some sort to shoot it with. And so Steven Spielberg and even Martin Scorsese have said that Scorpio Rising really influenced their work. So we'll talk about the 70s now. So television kind of came into its own during this time, and it really kind of was competition for the movie industry, and it really decreased the power and the influence of the studios in general. And at this time, in the late 1960s, the production code began to loosen its restrictions a little bit, with the civil rights movements that were going on and all of, the women's rights movements and all those things. Stuff just started to be less strict, basically. And so directors were really free to explore formally restricted storylines regarding relationships like race, violence, sexuality. And this led to a lot of experiments with characters and plots in westerns, thrillers, or romances. So an example of this would be Robert Altman's The Long Goodbye from 1973. And this film is a kind of a witty detective story that was adapted from a previous film noir novel that was written in the 1950s. And this movie was shot in the 70s, and it's a spin-off of the classic film noir 1950s storyline. And this genre of movie is actually considered sunshine noir, and it's characterized by scenes that look fun on the surface with charming characters, colorful, quirky fashions, but under the surface there's something wrong and dysfunctional, usually, the crime that's present in these films. And The Long Goodbye is described as many critics as undermining the classic film noir genre by kind of satirizing it and making fun of it in a way, in kind of a clever, subtle way. And so the main character is Philip Marlowe, and he's kind of a hapless, hardworking private eye, and he's adrift in the sunny, self-centered 1970s Los Angeles culture. And the plot of the movie is basically this. Marlowe gives a friend a ride to Tijuana, and then his friend is accused of killing his wife, and then turns up dead, and Marlowe sets out to prove his friend's innocence, and the cops end up suspecting him of murder, Marlowe of murder in the process. So in this movie, Robert Altman, the director, kind of simultaneously satirizes the post-hippie self-absorption of Southern California, and really made comment on the narrow-minded brutality of the cops and gangsters, and signaled kind of his fondness for old Hollywood, all at the same time with this movie. And he added a lot of subtle touches in the movie. So every time Marlowe appears in any scene, he lights a cigarette. The musical score consists of one song, basically played in different arrangements, and definitely numerous references to previous detective movies are present throughout the script. So let me see what our time is looking like. Okay, we're still got a few minutes, so we'll keep going. Trying to move as quickly as I can. I'm definitely not skipping as much from the chapter as I have before. So we'll talk about the blaxploitation movement next. And so Shaft is an early example of this type of movie that was actually successful with Black or African American audiences and white audiences as well. And it kind of showed the gritty urban life of Harlem. And it featured a lot of Black actors, African American actors, and shot by African Americans. But African American and white audiences both enjoyed them. And so this is basically, a Black gang leader hires the streetwise private investigator John Shaft, who is pictured here, to rescue his daughter who was kidnapped by the mafia. And it's a pretty basic plot for Hollywood, but the movie was revolutionary in that it showed scenes of gritty urban life from Harlem, and all of the stars are African American. And he's really well dressed, and he's really ruthless as well, the Shaft character. And he is eventually able to rescue the daughter, and he recruits help from an African American revolutionary group that's probably inspired by the actual group at this time, the Black Panthers, who were super important at this time with civil rights and African Americans. And so the movement was kind of controversial because it really seemed to reinforce a lot of stereotypes. But the movie's visual style, magnetic lead character, and the musical scores by Black musician Isaac Hayes is thought to have influenced later hip-hop culture, and it's also inspired several sequels, knockoffs, and remakes. So if you've ever seen 1997's Jackie Brown by Quentin Tarantino, that movie was heavily influenced by Shaft and the blaxploitation movement of the 1970s. And I think I might end it there and start on the next section in the next video.